Welcome to the Fragility Forum 2022 podcast series produced by the Fragility, Conflict and Violence Group of the World Bank Group. As complexity and uncertainty become the new normal, with complex crises posing new challenges, from the COVID-19 pandemic to climate change, this podcast series explores how the international community can best support countries affected by fragility, conflict and violence in a fast-changing global landscape.
Hello, I'm William McDermott of DCAF, the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, and I'm joined today by Vincenza Scherrer, Deputy Head of the Policy and Research Division at DCAF, and Badreddine Harti, a senior official with the UN mission in Libya. Until recently, he was the UN Special Advisor on Security Sector Reform, or SSR, to the former president of Burkina Faso. Today, our podcast will be on the role of security sector governance and reform in preventing violent conflicts. We will first hear from Vincenza about why security sector reform should be considered a tool to contribute to the prevention of violent conflicts, before turning to Badreddine, who will reflect on what this means in practice, drawing on the case of Burkina Faso. Vincenza, let's start with the basics. Why is this topic important?
Well, the vital importance of preventing violent conflict is enshrined in international policy documents, from the UN Sustaining Peace resolutions to the landmark UN World Bank report on pathways for peace. Not only does violent conflict have a direct human cost, but it also contributes to fragility and undermines development and security objectives. We know that investing in prevention is also considerably less expensive than responding to crises after they emerge. And while prevention efforts are fundamentally the responsibility of member states, international actors, and in particular the UN, often play an important supporting role. So to ensure all is being done to help avoid violent conflicts, we must act on every possible opportunity to prevent them. This includes expanding our understanding of how support to the good governance of the security sector is crucial to prevention efforts, not just in terms of strengthening the security sector's role in responding to crisis, but also in terms of better understanding its role in fueling or mitigating grievances which can contribute to violent conflict. Now, it goes without saying that context is everything. For every grievance that erupts into violent conflict, undoubtedly more do not. And the security sector may be at the heart of grievances in one country, but not in another. And even where it plays a role in rising tensions, this may be due to exclusion on the basis of ethnicity, for instance, in one context, or lack of effective service delivery in another. But the key message is that if we're not factoring in the role of the security sector into our structural prevention efforts, then we're missing a significant opportunity to do things better. This is important because, as seen by a recent Swiss-funded research study undertaken by DCAF, security sector reform, or what we call SSR, is not always being used as an effective prevention tool as it could be to really make a difference.
Vincenza, you are the lead author of DCAF's study on this topic. Can you say a few words about your research and its main findings?
Yes, well, the point of departure for our research was the realization that to meet the prevention mandate, some actors have labeled SSR activities as prevention without necessarily making any changes to everyday business. This may be explained by a lack of clarity on what needs to be done differently to ensure that SSR is playing a role in promoting prevention. This is a challenge that the UN, in particular, has been grappling with, consequently deciding last year to launch the development of UN technical guidance for staff on this issue. Within this framework, our study is part of a joint initiative between UN OROLSI's Security Sector Reform Unit and the World Bank, which aims to strengthen their partnership on sustaining peace in SSR. So our research sought to develop an empirically based understanding of the role of the security sector in fueling or mitigating grievances which can contribute to violent conflict. It's thus framed within the UN World Bank Pathways for Peace report, which identifies grievances as the main driver of conflict and notes that while each context is unique, conflict is thought to have the greatest risk of escalating to violence in societal spaces featuring contested access to political power and governance, land and resources, delivery of basic services, and justice and security. So, on the basis of a comparative analysis of over 12 country contexts, including several fragile and conflict-affected countries, we mapped the role the security sector tends to play across these 4 arenas of contestation. What we found is that the security sector often contributes to fueling grievances across the 4 arenas. And of course, the rationale is clear when it comes to the arena of security and justice itself. Tensions can be exacerbated significantly when access to security and justice is intentionally denied, for instance, by the police or courts on the basis of ethnicity or gender. But the security sector can also influence access to other arenas. For instance, security institutions manipulated by political leadership can aid or abet political interference and thereby play a role in reducing access to power and governance. Or the security sector can also reduce access to land and resources, for instance, through its role in enforcing discriminatory land policies or exploiting natural resources. While experiences mainly demonstrate the negative role the security sector can play in fueling grievances, we also found a few examples of the security sector mitigating grievances. For instance, the police stepping in to mediate a conflict on land claims at the community level in Guinea-Bissau, the military, for instance, constructing bridges and roads to help open service delivery to communities in Colombia. In practice, however, the security sector is often not being engaged with to make the most of its potential role as a source of resilience. So why is this important? Obviously, the security sector's primary role in relation to prevention is to respond to crisis and to intervene when there are tensions. For this reason, SSR is understood as important for operational prevention. That is to say, in terms of its role in short-term crisis measures. But what is clear from our analysis is that the potential implications of the security sector on prevention efforts is much wider. This means that we need to be working upstream to ensure that the security sector is not fueling grievances and, even better, is able to contribute to mitigating them.
The fact that the security sector not only plays an important role in responding to crisis, but may also contribute to fueling or mitigating longer-term grievances must have important implications for the way we conceive of SSR support. What are some of these implications?
Well, while SSR support should always be contingent on local context and needs, our research highlights a few broad priorities through a prevention lens. Obviously, supporting inclusive political agreements on the governance arrangements of the security sector is always a vital first step. But when it comes to promoting the good governance of the security sector through a prevention lens, it's particularly important that we're balancing accountability with effectiveness. We know that a singular focus on train and equip approaches can increase the likelihood of violent conflict. However, accountability efforts must also be accompanied by efforts to promote effectiveness. Otherwise, you have cases like Burkina or CAR, where crippling capacity gaps have contributed to a loss of trust in authorities and enabled opportunistic violence. So a balanced approach is really key. The second priority is a focus on inclusive service delivery, as it can alleviate social exclusion, which is often a driver of fragility and conflict. This should be predicated on equal access to security and justice, but also on equal opportunities to join the sector. Take Kyrgyzstan, for instance. In that case, poor representation of minority groups in the police became an important factor in the escalation of the violent crisis of 2010. The third priority is that support to security sector governance at the local level is vital. Across several contexts, from Liberia to Burkina Faso, disparate access to justice and security at the subnational level contributed to feelings of inequality and exclusion, thus fueling grievances, leading to security vacuums, which of course pose additional risks. And when the nearest police station or court is located hundreds of miles away without any practicable road, it's only natural that communities rely on local traditional or customary security providers. A final priority, therefore, is to map and engage with hybrid security actors, which can play an important role in either fueling or mitigating grievances as well.
So Vincenza, you've set out some priorities for what are likely to be SSR needs through a prevention lens, from support to balancing accountability with effectiveness, to engaging more at the local level to ensure that no one is left behind in terms of security and justice provision. What does this mean for the UN?
Well, first, while SSR should not be seen as a silver bullet, there is a need to reflect security sector related risks and drivers of conflict more systematically in assessments and in what is called political economy analysis more broadly. We must recognize that prevention, just like SSR, is an inherently political activity that requires a grasp of power relations and incentive structures among and between security sector actors. Analyzing those power relations would help the UN and other partners to make more informed decisions on how and when to support the reform of national security sectors. And linked to this, there's then a need to see the findings from these assessments actually translated into SSR support. Ultimately, to make a difference, SSR support must be adapted to context-specific prevention goals. In practice, however, there are a range of challenges. While we know that causes of conflict are deeply interlinked, the UN's and the World Bank's responses, for instance, remain largely fragmented. But any form of effective SSR support that seeks to address conflict-related risks requires stronger linkages between development and security actors, particularly when it comes to integrating SSR within broader public administration reforms, which are often led by the development pillar. In practice, different agendas, mandates, and capacities often limit integrated approaches across these actors. And moving forward, it's clear that the UN will need to strengthen efforts to build partnerships on SSR with international financial institutions, with development actors more broadly, and including, of course, the World Bank. At the same time, the political strategy of the UN must align with that of its national counterparts, or its strategy for prevention is likely to hit future stumbling blocks. This requires investing early on in strengthening local knowledge of SSR and supporting national dialogues, such as in the context of the development of national security policies, which may provide an important entry point for local level consultation on different security risks. At the same time, more efforts are needed to support nationals to lead and coordinate SSR efforts. Unfortunately, experience shows this is not always prioritized from the outset.
Thank you, Vincenza. Now let's turn to Badreddine to reflect on how these findings translate into practice. Badreddine, you recently worked for over 4 years as a UN Special Advisor to the President of Burkina Faso on rule of law and SSR, and have since deployed to serve the UN-supported security track in Libya, another conflict setting. Burkina Faso is a fragile and conflict-affected country, which is facing a particularly challenging situation from the recent coup to the challenges with radicalization in community defense groups. To what extent do the main findings of the research resonate with your experience in Burkina Faso of the role of the security sector in fueling or mitigating grievances?
Burkina offers indeed a prime example of how the security sector and its governance can play a role in fueling grievances, to a lesser extent, mitigating some across the arenas of contestation examined in the DCAF study. First and foremost, grievances driven by lack of access to security and justice are persistent. They impact the essence of renewing the social contracts as brought by the popular insurrection. In rural environments in Burkina Faso, police stations and tribunals are far and few between, and there are almost no military regiments in a number of those remote areas. This has resulted in security vacuums that have been filled by ethnically based self-defense groups, contributing at times to spiral violence and a significant toll on civilians. Initially, the government did not oppose their expansion, as these groups have strong ties to the political establishment and were seen as an asset in fighting crime and terrorism. However, without proper oversight mechanisms, the state can hardly control them now and are unable to hold them accountable following civilian massacres. Their competition with the state over its double monopoly on taxation and the legitimate use of force has weakened both the state security and justice sectors. Second, the military has played a role in limiting access to power and governance. This was first seen with the former elite force known as the Presidential Security Regiment, which contributed to a heightening of tensions that arose from the attempted removal of constitutional limits on presidential terms, and thus played a role in trying to prevent the political opposition from legitimately accessing governance and power. Most importantly, during the democratic transition post-insurrection, the army has sought to avoid the marginalization that it has lived through the Blaise regime. They sought a rapid build-up, challenged significant increase of budget, and resistant clarity of mission and accountability mechanisms. The coup last month came as a backlash after attempts of strengthening interior homeland security and of targeting corruption in the military. Ultimately, in the context of the coup, we should recall that the government's focus on counterterrorism and the lead taken de facto by the military in what is essentially an internal security threat has not only meant that little attention has been given to addressing underlying grievances, but has also heightened stigmatization and targeting of border communities seen as friendly to armed groups, especially the Fulani ones. The mistrust that needed to be mitigated in order to enhance human security in border and affected areas has been further strained by the overuse of force and the inability and unwillingness of government to provide adequate protection, access to justice and security, and services to the public. Now, in terms of access to land and resources, which in Burkina is closely tied to ethnic clashes in border areas and to the activities of informant and at times abusive non-state security and justice providers, SSR can also prove to be an effective preventive tool. In Burkina Faso, for example, popular dissent and mistrust in state institutions has triggered an insurrectional behavior from border communities and fueled recruitment in armed groups. Major civilian massacres, such as the attacks by the Kagawegos, a self-defense group on Yirgu in January 2019, a village populated by a Peul Fulani community, have claimed the lives of hundreds of civilians and sparked an acute sense of impunity. It has also denoted at a deeper level an adversely ethnic tension between ethnic groups, Mosis, Comanches, and other minor groups, in particular the normal herder Fulanis. In the last few years, the UN and other partners' support to the SSR process has brought civil society organizations and officials from the executive and legislative branch to discuss human security in all the regions of the country and generated an inclusive vision on how to enhance trust between populations and state institutions, on how to approach local decision-making, on how to approach reconciliation and social cohesion and strengthen it, and most importantly, how to rethink the social contract. The role of financial partners in that regard, like the World Bank, can also be crucial in turning these objectives into conditional indicators and benchmarks for funding. In fact, in countries like Burkina, the World Bank can play an important role in contributing to prevention aims, building on its conceptual work in Pathways for Peace, or its engagement through the Recovery and Peace Building Assessment, the National Plan for Development, PNDS, and the Emergency Program. The UN and the World Bank could come together to incentivize compliance by the state, including by conditioning the continuity of World Bank funding to the state delivery against SSR indicators of trust in state institutions, indicators of access to justice and security, indicators of accountability mechanisms, and of guarantees of non-return to gross human violations.
Thanks, Badreddine. What are some examples of how the UN has sought to support SSR through a prevention lens in Burkina Faso?
I would agree with Vincenza that an important entry point is to support national dialogue and current peace-building initiatives, especially dialogue on national security and trust between population and security and justice institutions, on social cohesion and on reconciliation to mitigate in-depth drivers of conflicts. In fact, a key priority for SSR in Burkina Faso through a prevention lens was to build inclusive platforms for SSR consultation at the local levels. The UN-supported fora held in 13 administrative regions to consult populations on their security needs and reflected later in inclusive local councils as per the national security policy and strategy, and triggered discussions on how to rebuild trust between the population and the forces of defense and the security and justice institutions, especially in remote Sahel districts. The civil society organizations, regrouped with the UN support in a dedicated SSR platform, played a central role in animating these fora. They briefed the executive and legislative branches on their analysis and provided recommendations to strengthen human security peer region and at national level. With UN support, they also conducted a gender study that has helped to ensure that the executive approach to SSR and the legislative oversights are gender responsive. The UN has also engaged closely with key transitional justice actors, including the High Council of Reconciliation, Ashgrun, and the Ministerial Department of Reconciliation to support institutional transitional reforms in the security sector and prevent the return to gross human rights violations.
What are some of the challenges and opportunities that the UN faces in providing SSR support through a prevention lens?
Well, both the General Assembly and Security Council have underlined the need to refocus on prevention in their twin resolutions on sustaining peace. The Security Council Resolution 2553 from 2020 on SSR also underlines that a representative, effective, professional, and accountable security sector is the cornerstone of peace and sustainable development and is important for conflict prevention, peace building, and sustaining peace. However, when it comes to proving concrete support to the needed reforms in the security sector, which could have helped to prevent conflict, such in the case of Burkina Faso, a number of challenges remain. First, in a non-mission context, the UN is deployed at the requests of national authorities, but SSR capacities remain invited and thus must display a particularly high level of political sensitivity. Without the backing of a Security Council mandate, SSR assistance may be terminated at any time. This meant, for example, that voicing concerns against stigmatization of minorities, especially the Pearl, against impunity, in particular for crimes committed by non-state armed groups called WAGOs, affiliated to customer leaders, or against corruption in the military, and the resistance of the military to reforms has to be done skillfully and with a no-harm approach to avoid political, social, and military backlashes. Other challenges include the feeble appeal of prevention to the partnership in non-mission settings, as these don't raise as much concern as conflicts in the agenda of the Security Council. But for example, IDPs in Burkina Faso have reached 1.3 million, double the numbers in Mali, and attacks in Burkina and IEDs have a similar magnitude as in Mali. Resources available in Mali as a UN mission setting have a stronger funding from the international community and partnership initiatives than they would be in Burkina. The prevention mindset is yet to be promoted in the partnership to attract sufficient funding. However, the UN remains uniquely positioned to reconcile between the political and the programmatic aspect of SSR and co-lead with the host country the partnerships in interventions for coherence and effectiveness. As an example, the partnership's tendency to support the use of force by the host as a primary, between quote unquote, counter-terrorist efforts and its subsequent limits in Burkina denotes the necessity to hold a policy dialogue between the UN and the partnerships on venues and priorities of prevention. It also calls for a strengthening of SSR within a holistic and coordinated approach to rule of law and security institutions, building among all intervening partners to ensure coherence and effectiveness. The UN can also build on its nexus approach between the peace and security, the development, humanitarian, and the human rights pillar that relates SSR to the strengthening of the rule of law, to the protection of civilians, to the renewal of social contracts, to reconciliation and social cohesion, and broadly to state and nation building. The nexus intervenes in particular to cross-fertilize the fields of security and development. Security actors might also play a catalytic role in building trust with remote communities while using their engineering and medical assets to build and maintain vital infrastructure and contribute to the welfare of marginalized communities. Many achievements in the Sahel by development actors, infrastructures and so on, in affected areas couldn't predictably survive the impact of the intrusion of armed groups and were swiftly reversed. Development and security delivery need to evolve under a resilient and pragmatic approach, coordinated and consistently evaluated.
Badreddine, you're now heading the ceasefire mechanism component of the UN mission in Libya. Obviously, this new role is very much at the heart of prevention efforts in the country. Can you share any insights with us on the role SSR plays in prevention in this context?
Yes, definitely. Libya might be indeed an interesting example of the costs of non-prevention, but also of the necessity to build one within the political process out of a conflict setting. While it remains early to comprehensively assess the role of security mediation to the political process, the UN-supported security track in this country has already significantly contributed to peace in the country. Mediating and supporting the work of the 5+5 Joint Military Committee from East and West has yielded defining results in crafting and implementing a ceasefire, respected for over a year now, in opening lifeline roads, coastal and southern, and air routes, which have shown a preventive value within the conflict and the contribution to an conducive political framework towards dialogue and appeasement. The role of SSR in conflicts, in its broader scope of looking into entry points in civil-military relations amidst conflicts, in mitigating adverse dynamics between politics and the use of force, in easing apprehensions and ambitions of power sharing, and ensuring security-related measures is frequently captured in political agreements, including in security annexes. It remains central to the prevention and sustaining peace agendas to frame conducive security and political environments and carries an important potential of dividends in peace and security.
Thanks so much, Vincenza and Badreddine, for sharing these insights and making the case for a more nuanced understanding of the challenges and opportunities of supporting SSR through a prevention lens.
This wraps up this episode of the podcast series. Thank you for listening, and please check out our other podcast. For that, and to learn more about the World Bank Group efforts in environments affected by fragility, conflict, and violence, please visit our website www.worldbank.org/FCV.